Amazing opportunity to be here with you, especially Rachel Lee and Catherine Hugh. And also for the amazing writers who are here, whose work has inspired me for so many years. So I feel. And I actually had no idea that plants were going to be so central when I decided to start my talk with this kind of low-tech but incredibly complicated material item, which is corn. And if you're familiar with Mesoamerican indigenous understandings and origin stories, it is that humans actually are corn, that out of, different from a Christian or monotheistic understanding that men and women are created differently, but from Earth, that actually humans are created at the same time out of corn, and that when someone begins to eat corn as a child, you incur a debt to the larger world that will be paid back through sort of long-term relations of reciprocity. This is deep present understandings of relation to landscape and plant life and animals, and sort of an ethical relation to the world. If you sort of practice correct human interactions, then you should have actually good interactions with the animals that might eat your crops or things like that. And if you spend time in Central America, you know that there's corn as a part of every single meal, sort of regardless. And even in like the most small, tiny spots where people are living in the city, they'll try to have at least like one stalk of corn growing in a pot. It's like a very important part of life. So I actually wanted to pass this around and touch it. And this old, completely fabulous images of pre-Columbian Mayan bodies, right, where that the children had these sort of body transformations where the idea was to make the head look like an ear of corn with the one sort of piece of hair going on. So I wanted to sort of begin thinking through time and its cyclicalness if you're involved in planting and harvesting, with of course the fact that it's 2012. And all these stories about Mayan cyclical time that is supposed to end now. And I went super low tech on this stuff. I'm actually have my hand up. And these are just a couple of actually images, and there aren't enough for everyone, but pass them around, have to share. That pull together some of the issues around accounting as a sort of system of time, sort of when do you account for things that are debt or credit, when do you get to the zero balance, with other notions of time, some of the promissory questions that have been brought up in Melinda Cooper and other people's work, with questions of time maybe coming back and circulating. So I just wanted to sort of keep that in the mix, with some of the work I'm doing elsewhere on the powered number and the data, which I think has been informing a lot of the work here. And I'm sorry, I'm actually not going to give you a little overview of the paper that I put, because I felt constrained to sort of do the work I said I was going to do in a paper that I wrote that I didn't do. So, I want to turn then from thinking about corn to thinking about these questions about the past and the present. I'm going to quote, "We love those shows. CSI, Baby Orphan, Law and Order. Everyone here watches them. Sometimes we'll be trying to schedule a meeting, and there are certain times no one can make it, and then we'll realize it's because of the show." End quote. I was in Guatemala City at the Mirna Mac Foundation, a human rights organization named for the Guatemalan anthropologist who was murdered by the state on September 11, 1990. Enrique went on, "It's amazing. They can convict with a single hair, a microscopic bit of dust. Here we have bones, we have whole skeletons. We have the tiro de gracia, the execution shot. We've got clothes, we've got witnesses, we've even got confessions, and we still can't get the perpetrators put in jail." End quote. It took over a decade for Mirna's sister Helen and a network of allies to convict Mirna's killers, and then several were released on appeal. I think many of us in the room would echo Enrique's sense that recent developments in the biosciences are amazing and seem to promise something like life unlimited. The technophilic promises of needed fixes for humanity's problems, from injustice to cancer, from war to pollution, science fiction today, cold hard fact tomorrow. My students, like so many of us who are ill or seeking Gaia-saving alternatives to apocalypse, not to mention venture capitalists, are deeply invested in such progress narratives. Their curmudgeonly teacher is mostly unsuccessful in wagging my finger and pushing for attention to costs as well as benefits, to heighten surveillance and deepening control. Facebook is using you. Coal mining, toxic waste, Foxconn suicides, and the guinea pigging of prisoners and poor humans, and R&Ding the miracles that we draw on. As an anthropologist of Guatemala, a small, poor country still recovering from 36 years of genocidal civil war, with some of the worst life statistics in the hemisphere, and with the majority Mayan population the most affected, I try to remind my students that the amazing fruits of technoscience are so not evenly distributed. In fact, life seems quite limited there in the aftermath of war. There is so much death, illness, poverty, malnutrition, crime, the growing drug war with attendant addictions, femicide, minimal education possibilities, the increasing dangers of crossing the border in search of something better. What science there is, as a Guatemalan friend once grimly joked, is, quote, maquila science, like those border assembly plants where all the inputs and all the profits are foreign. But I mainly come off as a technophobe, a Luddite, or since I'm actually too docile to smash machines, I just want to be Amish. So I have to stop myself here and interrupt, as I was interrupted 27 years ago on my first trip to Guatemala. And I'm sorry, this is an old story. If you actually read something, I already heard it. But the past keeps trying to teach me this, and so I'm going to do it again. It was a moment when I thought I knew what I was getting into with my first trip. It was to one of the most traditional areas of Guatemala, where sort of Mayan daykeepers and those who keep the Mayan calendar were understood to have a very strong presence, where traditional indigenous culture was still quite lively in terms of distinctive clothing and other ritual practices. It was also an area where there were a large number of refugees and victims, where over 100 villages had been massacred and destroyed. And often in extremely low-tech ways, the Guatemalan genocide was mainly done by machete and fire and actually like smashing children's heads against trees, but it wasn't very high-tech. The counterinsurgency that was unleashed by the state was aimed at smashing a revolutionary and indigenous millenarian project that was explicitly seeking more equal distribution of life. So the first time I went to this town, I stepped off the bus and was surrounded by a group of kids, and they were like, oh, do you want to, your shoes shine? Do you buy something? You know, don't you want some chocolate or something to eat? And then they said, well, what is your name? I said, well, my name's Diana. And they were like, oh, it's the queen of the lizards. It's the queen of the lizards. Look, it's the queen of the moon. And I had no idea what they were talking about. Part of me wondered, you know, did I just need better skincare? Another part thought, well, maybe, I mean, this is an area that had been held for several years by the guerrilla forces, that's how North America and Gringa would be seen as this kind of crazy, creepy thing. But it turned out that they had been watching, again, this is 1985, the first rendition of The, okay, which is now back, so the past returning in these people. But if you remember, The is about these, you know, aliens. They claim to be helpful. They're bringing totally developmental, sort of related, you know, will to improve stuff. And all they want is a little bit of water off the earth. But of course, it turns out that they're like terrible and eating humans, and they're going to pillage, etc. So I tell this story because it was a moment where I was called out by science fiction in a place that's supposedly amodern or unmodern, right? I was forced to think about a lot more is going on here than I had expected, right? It's not just a site for anthropological ethnostalgia or for sort of humanitarian self-constituting othering where one will come and save these poor people from their victimage. And no more than they would countenance. I was not allowed to be comfortable in these divisions between modernity, which of course would be the site of more and better life, and tradition, which would be life limited. So I was pushed less towards solidarity, as I've talked about elsewhere, than into something like fluidarity. This was before I'd read Riga Rai, but she later helped me to put the labile back into these laboratories. Right, laboratories rather than achievements of modernity. And of course, since John Haraway's been invoked many times, that wonderful line in the manifesto where she says, one is not enough and two is too many. So I would keep that as my sign if we're going to think about numbers. But labor is also a root of those experimental sites and the conditions of possibility for life, limited and un. And as Melinda Cooper has shown, among the many other things she's shown me, the work that it takes to create the US biotech revolution, the efforts, the warlike strategies and hegemony building that brought into being what she calls the prospective value of promise, turning life science speculation into a highly profitable, indeed rational enterprise, end quote. So how an infrastructure, like Michelle Murphy has talked about, gets built, gets sedimented, becomes a context in which a DNA sample, a stem cell, a reading of heavy metals in a blood or water system can happen, and in turn make other things happen. And it takes labor to create those things. Now, there's a famous story in the hagiography of Che Guevara that soon after the rebels' disastrous landing off the Grandma, he was wounded and sort of had this moment where he had to decide, was he going to carry both his gun and his medical kit? Which was he going to take? And we all know. He took the gun. And I think he saw, or he talks about this later, saying both of these were life technologies, right? That were, but the decision came because he thought he could save more lives with the gun in the long run by taking the state and transforming the structures that consign somebody to die than he could sort of at that scale of the individual with the medical kit. I don't know if any of you saw that New York Times science piece a couple, I think last week, about the actual incredibly limited AIDS epidemic in Cuba, which suggests that Ernesto was right. So when Rachel asked us to think about what to talk about here, she called for this conference to think the amazing through the structural violences that feminist, anti-racism, and post-colonial critiques have unveiled. And not to mention that revered theorist of science and technology, Karl Marx, who pushed us to view technologies themselves less as good or bad than recombinantly produced as liberatory or pernicious via the relations of production and consumption in which they are enmeshed, produced, and producing. So amazingly effective in the science fiction realms of CSI and law and order, but frustratingly limited in the post-war Guatemalan justice system where the perpetrators still mostly run things. Right, that's sort of what's happening with these enmeshings of the sort of the same technologies, but how do we produce an infrastructure that makes certain things possible and certain things not? And so that's why in my paper I tried to suggest that accounting, equivalence, political rallies, and legal precedents, as well as bioassays to read cyanide levels in drinking water, are all of these bio-life technologies that we might want to be thinking about. So I want to quickly embed both the everyday and the amazing text and the temporal sweeps, clogs and swirls and latency lag and the impingements of the future and the past on the present. And I want to take you to the Urbana Cemetery on the outskirts of Guatemala City.
And I have some more about that.
I'm not a photographer. As probably you know, Latin America counterinsurgency regimes are well known for disappearing people in addition to killing them outright. And in Guatemala, there are between 45,000 and 50,000 people who remain disappeared, meaning that no one knows where they are, whether they're alive or dead. Now, since the worst of the violence was in the early 1980s, most people assume they're dead, but every once in a while, like a body will show up, which is very old but is identifiable, and so the terror just sort of keeps circulating about what does it mean to have been held for so long. It wasn't until 2011 that one of the forensic anthropology teams, ones that have been doing some of the exhumations in the highlands and in the city, got permission to go into the ossuary of one of the major public cemeteries. And for those of you who are used to earth burials, when people have those above ground niches, when people stop paying rent on the niche, they actually just pull the bones out and put them in a big pit. So there's this huge pit that's full of basically 50 years of extra bones. And the forensic team is going into that and trying to sort of divide literally thousands and thousands and thousands of bones between those who were just dumped there the way they legally were allowed to, and bodies that had been put there by those who disappeared. So it's an unbelievable effort, and some of the images that I'm passing around are actually the pit itself and the bags of bodies. Many of them just regular folks, and some of them with the execution shot suggesting, and they found over 800 there that they think were killed by death squads. The question is then how to identify them, right? And so the question of DNA becomes, one of these life technologies. The difficulty is, of course, 30 years later, right, where this sort of unending crime is still so much in the present. How do you find humans in a kinship relation who are both still alive, available, that you can find, and who are close enough kin-wise to be able to give you the information to identify those people? And in fact, they've sent teams up to the Latino fairs here in LA to take swabs because so many Guatemalan exiles are in this city. So just the difficulties of creating some of that landscape and infrastructure through which to figure out who these folks are. So I could say a lot more about that. But what I tried to do in the paper was, again, trying to think simultaneously with these kinds of violences of the past, with the violences of the present, and the kinds of future violences that I've been thinking about a lot with Michelle Murphy, and sort of spoke a lot about this effort to close an open pit or a mountaintop removal mine that's in a very heavily indigenous area, almost on the border with Mexico, and owned by the Canadian multinational Goldcorp. And sort of thinking about the way in which indigenous activists, an amazing number of them women, who've taken on this company with all of its hired goons and all of the sort of history of sort of state elite economic willingness to murder people who question their accumulation strategies. And finding sort of these women doing stuff like protesting, burning the cars of the engineers, cutting down the high tension power lines, running to the mine, being willing to go into hiding and take care of others' children while women are on the run, traveling to denounce intimidation. And I talked about a nun, an indigenous nun who's been also very involved and simultaneously kind of trying to bring Mayan understandings of faith and the relation to the world into the Catholic hierarchy, at the same time that the Catholic hierarchy is moving to increasingly think of itself as involved in human rights that are related to the environment and ecological struggles. So there's a really interesting kind of swirling going on there. So to finish, I'd like to return to the notion of the corn as the body and as life and these sort of unmodern forms in which sort of I think people are increasingly connecting up to past, present, and future in the body. And to finish, I'd like to sort of apologize for being from North Carolina. We've just passed this horrible homophobic, but we are paying reparations to sterilization victims, and we have the race justice thing where this guy's death penalty was just commuted. So so given that around the homophobia, there's no way that I want to naturalize any sort of relation between women and life, but sort of trying to think through these questions about past and present and power and infrastructures. I find those relations of women as, and feminist questions really important of thinking about sustenance, survival, growth, etc. And the title, I think, came from the old idea of the limited company, right? When you were sort of pushing towards life unlimited. Yeah. And sorry, I know you don't want to be the policewoman. So it's corporate shorthand, right? LTD, which literally stands for, thank you, Wikipedia, a flexible form of enterprise that shields stockholders from responsibility for the debts or actions of a corporation. Okay? So this question about limited liability, and sort of once it's limited, that means that someone else is getting liable for it, the labile and the liable, right? So again and again, who is the one who's had to take responsibility for those things for which the company is not liable, right? It's so often been women, it's so often been indigenous people, it's so often been poor people or people of color or the colonized, right? So when we're trying to think through what is post-racism, post-colonialism, feminism sort of tried to teach us, is about thinking about who has been liable over long periods of time. It's resisted what Susan talked about, that unequal distribution of attention and care, right? It's saying, no, we have to pay attention and care about these things. And there's another thing in the Wikipedia about limited liability companies members. It says, quote, are subject to the same alter ego piercing theories as corporate shareholders. However, it is more difficult to pierce the LLC veil because the limited liability companies do not have many formalities to maintain. So long as the LLC and the members do not commingle funds, it is difficult to pierce its veil. So piercing the veil is, of course, what feminists do, right? It's like, you know, you don't just let things stay naturalized the way they've always been. You ask who gets responsibility. And of course, commingling is all about these forms of new generation and sort of ways in which people are called in, produced, and producing these new forms. And of course, to pierce the veil without losing its hallucinatory quality is what, you know, Conrad asked us to do, as Michael Taussig takes up again in the Shamanism and Colonial book. So when we're trying to think about these questions of accountability, I want to keep that sense, and we might think of it as the otherworldly or the too extraordinary, of how to sort of find sort of how these things work, but not give up, like how incredibly strange they are. So that would be my thought. Thank you.